Provenance, Chapter 1. Cartwright slumped back onto the cold stone floor, staring away into the darkness at the pool of light that illuminated her enigmatic smile. The room seemed bigger than he remembered it, and now smelled differently. A death-like mask contorted his face, giving him the countenance of a Holocaust survivor staring out from some archaic newsreel. The beads of sweat began to roll down his forehead as he tried to remember how this obsession had begun, and how the life he remembered had come to an end. Feeling the bile rise in his throat, he looked again into her haunting green eyes, and knew nothing would ever be the same again. The alarm clock on the bedside table sang out like a cat that had inadvertently got its testicles caught in the cat flap. A pale, thin arm rose from beneath the duvet, slamming down on the clock and halting its tortured screams. Several minutes passed before the rest of Andrew David Cartwright slithered out of the bed to greet the day that would forever change his life. His slight, almost anorexic frame pulled away the duvet and stretched away the sleep from his body. Walking to the bathroom, he ran his hands through his tousled blonde hair and stared at the bony, grey-faced apparition that was staring back at him. "The mirror never lies," he exclaimed. "Which means you really do look that bad." Reflecting on the ordinariness of his awakening, he suddenly remembered what had prompted the late night that led to this moment. In a single stride, he crossed the room to the corner that housed his desk. The desk was groaning under the weight of heavy tomes on art history and literature. Had it not been for the fact that every desk belonging to a student in his final year of university looked like this, it could have been entered for the Turner Prize. Without bothering to dress, he sat down in front of the book, which a few days earlier had been propping up his hastily erected shelves. He began to read again the passage which had shone out of the page like a lighthouse in a storm.
"My master grows ever weaker, and I think it is highly unlikely that he will see another summer. The once great man has been rambling and incoherent for the past 6 months. It is more by luck than virtue that he has not been incarcerated in a home for the criminally insane. His works of art have been spent many years hence, and he has not produced a single piece worth noting. I have been attending to his daily needs in a way that far exceeds my position as the protégé to the great Leonardo da Vinci."
The books on Italian Renaissance art and the accompanying dog-eared manuscript had come into his possession completely by chance. A well-respected member of the Cambridge University Arts faculty had died suddenly the previous month, and on clearing out his rooms, Cartwright had taken an interest in his works of Da Vinci and other painters of the time. "Doesn't make any sense," he thought aloud, reading and rereading the same passage. The passage in question had been written in 1516 by Gian Giacomo, the lifelong companion, and some would say homosexual lover, of Leonardo da Vinci. "Something just doesn't add up," he exclaimed again loudly, his head starting to pound with the weight of the discovery he was suspecting he had made. Chapter 2. Crossing the busy roads in the centre of Cambridge, Andrew Cartwright headed to a rendezvous with his old professor and mentor, Dr. Jonathan Miller. He hadn't seen him since attending the funeral of Miller's wife the previous year, and was beginning to feel ashamed about his obvious absence from his former mentor's life. "Andrew, over here!" a familiar voice called from a darkened corner of the coffee shop. It was a shop familiar to him, having spent a large part of his college years studying in the de facto library cum coffee house. As he strode across the slightly sticky floor, the old familiar smell of strong coffee and musty old ledgers filled his nostrils, almost making him retch, but he was unsure whether it was the smell or the memories of long nights studying that made him feel unwell. "Dr. Miller, I presume," Andrew joked, in his best Victorian explorer accent. Jonathan laughed, even though Andrew had greeted him this way almost every time they had met over the last 10 years. Rising from his seat, he embraced him, which took his young protégé by surprise, not because of the warmness of his welcome, but the inherent desperation of his grip. "How are you, my boy?" Jonathan sang out cheerfully. As usual, he didn't give Andrew the chance to reply, before launching into a diatribe about the state of the economy, the green agenda, and the price of coffee in this Americanized dustbin of humanity. He looked older, frailer than he remembered. Recalling the first time he had met Dr. Miller, he observed that if he took every caricature of the nutty, scatty professor from every literary book in history, he still wouldn't come close to the stereotype that was sitting right in front of him. Right down to the leather patches on his elbows and his mop of unruly hair, Dr. Miller was an absent-minded academic of the old school, but still the finest brain in Britain when it came to the Italian Renaissance. "Have you got it with you?" Miller asked, almost furtively, as if he were buying an under-the-counter magazine of the brown paper bag variety. "Yes, it's in my bag," Andrew replied, in a hushed, almost secretive tone. "Well, let the dog see the rabbit, my boy," Miller enthused, as he sat wild-eyed with anticipation. He had thought twice before calling Dr. Miller with his discovery, not because he didn't trust him, but because he knew how involved and excited he got over the slightest bit of Da Vinci news. Pulling the musty old manuscript from his bag, he glanced around furtively, before pushing it over the table. "Now, tell me again how you came across this, and don't leave anything out." Andrew explained how he had been a student of the late Sebastian Kroll, and, being his closest friend on campus, was asked to clear out his rooms when he passed away. "Is that the same Kroll that went on record to support that horrible Dan Brown book a couple of years ago?" He was of course referring to the Da Vinci Code, which had turned a whole new generation onto the works of Leonardo, and had seen footfall at La Louvre double almost overnight. Yeah, we could never understand why Kroll would have gone on the record like that, to support a work of fiction, a very flawed one at that. "Money, my dear boy, money!" Miller snapped, shooting across a caustic glance. He knew instantly he had inadvertently opened a can of worms as far as the relationship between these two respected professors was concerned. Doctors Miller and Kroll had attended Cambridge together, both studying on the same art scholarship. They had been great friends and scholars, spending weekends with each other's families and eventually sharing student accommodation together. Like most great scholars, their relationship was fiery and intense at times, and they would have blazing rows about politics, religion, and predominantly art. Halfway through their midterms, Kroll disappeared to Italy, and Miller didn't see or hear anything from him for the next 6 years. "He came back a different man, you know," Miller said, snatching Andrew away from his thoughts. "Turned his back on everything in his old life, including me, and now, all these years later, I could be looking at the reason why." He paused for what seemed like an eternity, looking down at the dog-eared, sepia-coloured manuscript. "If this is genuine, which we have yet to ascertain, this could be the biggest art find in modern history, and one that will almost certainly break my heart." Studying the face of his ageing friend, he noticed a single tear begin to well up in his tired, weary eyes. "You see, Andrew, it is common knowledge that Leonardo was a flawed human being. Not because of his homosexuality, but because he was a lover of children. Boys, to be precise. What would be known today as a paedophile." This knowledge was not news. It had been a persistent story that had been doing the rounds in the art world for years. This man, Giacomo, was his lover, and had been in his company since he was 10 years old. Leonardo used to refer to him as Soleil, or Little Devil. But this document puts him in Da Vinci's life until well after the master's death. Miller looked across the table, with a troubled look that Andrew had not seen before. "Yet history tells us that Giacomo left Da Vinci and died in a duel a year before Leonardo's death." Andrew looked on, his head swimming. He hadn't eaten or slept properly for several days, and found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the conversation. "Can I take it away for testing?" Andrew stared blankly at his friend, the same distant stare Miller had seen many times from his young protégé. "Andrew!" he snapped. "It is very important that before we go any further, I get this authenticated." "Sorry. Yes, I agree. There is no use getting worked up if it's some kind of studenty fake." As the words left his lips, he almost at once regretted them, and recognised the paradox that the statement produced. As Miller slipped away with the manuscript, He half wished never to see it again. Chapter 3. As the dim light in the gallery of Le Louvre threatened to envelop him, he rose unsteadily to his feet. The tempered air within the chamber had dried out his throat, making it difficult to swallow. The security surrounding this room was legendary, but he feared he would never leave it alive. He thought of all the people passing the huge glass pyramid of the museum's entrance and longed to breathe the clean, crisp spring air. A stirring in the corridor reminded him that he wasn't alone. Whispered voices speaking in deep, guttural French cut through the gallery like a knife through butter, making him wish he had studied harder in language classes. As he approached the great master's work, her haunting eyes followed him every step of the way, shining out of the darkness, pulling him into her world of majesty and mystique, yet secretly pleading with him to stop, to walk away, to not rob her of her deepest, darkest secret. Chapter 4. The university's summer recess was coming to a close. The precincts of the Cambridge campus would soon be thronging with a new intake of students, destined to become the lawyers and doctors of the next generation, but for now they were deserted. Just a barren maze of ancient stone structures that silhouetted against the early evening sky like the gates of Hades. The summer air was warm, with a Mediterranean breeze, but the faint aroma of distant barbecues and petrol fumes were most definitely British. Sitting cross-legged on a bench within the deserted precincts, he mused over the events of the last few weeks. Secretly, he wished he was sat around one of those obligatory summer barbecues, drinking cheap red wine and observing how the changes of the season prompted British people to move all of their worldly possessions into their garden and prompted all the menfolk to revert back to a quest for fire. As the last pink hues of the sun set over the distant horizon, a strange chill swept over him. Something was amiss. The smell of petrol and smoke had mutated from a halcyon memory to an actual sensory event. The warm orange glow over the horizon now appeared angry and threatening, as only a building engulfed by flames can conjure. The sound of fire engines rushing past the small quad of buildings jolted him into action. Not really understanding why, he broke out into a jog, then a run, before pounding the pavement in a full-on sprint. Rounding the corner, his lungs bursting out of his chest, the familiar taste of blood in the back of his throat made him realize that running 6 blocks was no longer a small feat for this one-time cross-country champion. The sight that met his tired, bloodshot eyes was nothing short of carnage. The whole block that contained the science faculty and his halls of residence was ablaze. Acrid black smoke hung heavy in the air, torturing his lungs still further. He looked on helplessly, watching the flames engulf the room he had occupied since arriving at the university 2 years earlier. As the paintwork bubbled and the window panes exploded with an almost poetic display of colour and form, he thought of all the work he had stored on his laptop, all of the books he had yet to read. This all paled, however, with the abject relief of knowing the manuscript was safe in the hands of Dr. Miller. No sooner had the thought entered his head, his phone beeped, indicating he had received a text. Seeing that the message was from Dr. Miller made Andrew smile, as he wondered how this great wordsmith would condense the contents of his thoughts into a brief text-speak message. Opening the message, the smile quickly slipped from his lips, as the great man's words burned into his brain like a farmer branding his flock. It simply read, "It has begun." Chapter 5. Jonathan Miller sat nursing a large glass of single malt whisky in the Irish-themed pub he had chosen for the meet with his former student. The mock-period booths in the pub's interior made the meeting more private, yet offered the relative safety of a public place. He had been unsettled since the fire at the halls of residence. Even more unsettling was the fact that he had heard about the fire from an unknown source almost at the time the match was struck. Staring into the bottom of the whisky glass like countless academics before him, he wagered that none had ever felt the burden with which he was now encumbered. The professor's eyes were puffy and red. A slight tremble in his hand betrayed his usual calm exterior. At every sound he would jump, fearing the secret he had discovered by proxy had somehow become public knowledge. As his nerves began to calm, the door of the booth swung open, causing him to spasm involuntarily, which in turn sent whiskey swimming over the table.
"Good God! Can't you give a man some warning? You could have whistled or something."
The sight that met Cartwright's eyes summed up Miller's findings without a single word being uttered.
"I'm pleased you're okay. I was worried what with the fire."
Miller tried to continue, but all of his pleasantries seemed insincere and out of place.
"It is genuine."
3 little words that on their own meant nothing, but in the context of recent events took the wind out of Cartwright's body like a punch to the stomach. He slumped onto the plush, pale and breathless, believing for the first time since his journey began that he was going to die.
"Breathe, man, for God's sake!"
Miller exclaimed to his now hyperventilating friend. Chapter 6. The day was warm and humid, and the people of Cambridge were full of the joys of the new summer term. 2 of the city's famous sons, however, were a million miles from joy. Sitting in their tiny booth, they exchanged haunted looks over the table, in what could be mistaken for a tableau of a condemned man confessing his sins before execution. It had been almost 5 minutes since Dr. Miller had revealed the truth about the manuscript. A truth that for many would have been a small subheading in the national press, not even making the TV news. But for these 2 academics, it had far-reaching consequences.
"The manuscript was written in 1516, shortly before Da Vinci's death. They have dated the vellum, on which it is written, to around the same time, give or take 2 years.
Cartwright knew the dating of ancient artifacts had been notoriously unreliable, which gave him a brief sense of calm, until Miller delivered his final blow.
"The handwriting on the document matches several examples of Giacomo's writing, both from his own works of prose and from examples that accompanied the sale of some recent Da Vinci sketches."
He knew that Miller didn't make mistakes, and that this information gave the document a genuine and irrefutable provenance.
Living with a great master of the arts has not always been easy. He is expectant, not demanding of me, in many ways, and has taken great lengths to separate me from the rest of humanity. My own artistic prowess has been devoured by the majesty of such a towering shadow. It is off the back of a great man that my true worth as an artist will one day be recognized. A reflected glory is a glory nonetheless, even if it is achieved with a demon on my back. Yes, I shall be forever known as a great Renaissance painter, but only ever from the back.
Chapter 7. The 2 men emerged from their place of solace and confusion, blinking into the blinding mid-afternoon sun. Their worlds had changed. Nothing seemed clear anymore. Black was white, and white was black. The 2 friends had mutually agreed to lie low for a while, not wanting a repeat of the fire that had destroyed Cartwright's digs.
"Take it easy, my friend,"
Miller said to Cartwright. If he had known that these were to be his final words, the great scholar may have thought of something a little more profound. Andrew smiled, knowing they would both have to follow the example of Dr. Kroll and disappear. Holding each other's gaze for what seemed like an eternity, Cartwright pulled his laptop bag on his shoulder and turned in the direction of the city centre. He had barely walked 50 yards before his distant thoughts were wrenched from his mind by the sound of crashing metal and breaking glass. His world stopped, a dead calm in his brain. Without even turning around, he already knew what had happened. As his senses returned, he was aware of people screaming and the sound of a vehicle screeching away at high speed. Turning slowly, he steeled himself, only allowing the tiniest sliver of hope to enter his mind. The limp, lifeless body of his friend was lying in an unnatural position in the gutter, the victim of an apparent hit and run. He ran over to Miller, the life slowly draining out of him. Cradling his head, he was surprised and relieved to see his eyes flicker open. Through dilated pupils, his friend fought in vain to find a focus, his body failing. Summoning up the last ounce of his strength, he he whispered 3 words into his friend's ear.
Pop the panel.
Chapter 8. The wind whistled softly through the summer foliage. The day was bright, sunny even, which betrayed the morbid and foreboding experience of burying a friend. 6 people. That was all the life of Jonathan Miller was worth. Most of them half-baked academics who didn't have a clue what the great man had represented. Pulling the collar of his jacket up around his neck, he exchanged pleasantries with the professional mourners, recognising every one of them from Dr. Kroll's funeral a few months earlier. Declining a lift back, he politely excused himself from the wake. Making his way through the graves, he stealthily returned to where he had left the catalyst behind Miller's death. Reaching the grave of the late John Smith, he glanced around with an air of paranoia, and for good reason. The space behind the crumbling gravestone, where his laptop bag had once nestled, was now as empty as the rest of his rapidly decaying life. Before having time to react, he heard a voice behind him, speaking in broken English. "Are you looking for this, Mr. Cartwright?" the voice said, thrusting forward Andrew's bag. Making an instinctive grab for the bag, he was rewarded with a swift and effective punch to the stomach, leaving him crumpled on the ground, rather too close to the late Mr. Smith. "Gentlemen, please, we are civilized, no? Please, Mr. Cartwright, forgive my rather overzealous colleagues." The tall gentleman gave a hand gesture, which alerted his minders to back off, which, like 2 obedient pit bulls, they duly did.
"Who are you?"
Cartwright asked, the breath slowly returning to his shattered lungs. "I am the man with all of the answers, Mr. Cartwright. Now walk with me." Andrew got to his feet and followed behind the tall gentleman, all of the time looking for an escape route or a chance to grab back his property. The gentleman in question was Francois Lafrère, a well-respected, if not slightly corrupt official of the French government, whose company was an underwriter for major works of art, including the Mona Lisa. Andrew listened intently as the past 4 weeks of his life began to unfold in front of his tear-stained eyes. "I was so sorry to hear about the death of your friend, a terrible business." "Friends," Cartwright growled. "I have lost 2 of them in the last 6 months, both of them involved with that manuscript." "Ah yes, the manuscript. I presume you have read it, and no doubt a fellow as bright as yourself knows exactly what Giacomo was referring to." He didn't know whether he was being played. With all of these open graves, getting rid of his body wouldn't exactly be a difficult task. He responded to the question with an indifferent shrug. "Oh, come now, Mr. Cartwright. You must now know that the world-famous Mona Lisa was not in fact painted by the great Leonardo da Vinci, but by his boy-lover Gian Giacomo." Andrew knew, and had known since the first day the manuscript came into his possession. Even so, hearing it blurted out in such a matter-of-fact manner took him a little by surprise. Even in his own mind, he hadn't admitted his find, and Dr. Miller certainly had no intention of lending his oratory prowess to such a thought. "Can you see my predicament, Mr. Cartwright? My investment company underwrites the insurance on this most exquisite old master." Cartwright's mind was swimming, and still consumed with surviving this unscheduled and unpleasant encounter. "The insurance premium alone is worth somewhere in the region of £1.6 million a year, and you see, with this manuscript in your possession, we could stand to lose all of that." Andrew started to focus on the conversation, and was about to interject, when Francois put a finger to his lips, indicating Andrew should be silent, and like a naughty schoolboy, he complied. Listen, you do not want to miss anything. You see, if the Mona Lisa was ever to be exposed as a fake, it would be sensationally revealed by me. Now why would I do such a foolhardy thing, I hear you ask?" Andrew didn't ask. He was still smarting from being dismissed like a dopey adolescent, and besides, he was already 1 step ahead, and despite Francois's insistence, he interrupted the narcissistic Frenchman. "You wouldn't. Not unless the painting was stolen or damaged beyond repair. Then, when La Louvre came cap in hand for an insurance payout, you would roll out this new Provenance, prove it a fake, and thereby invalidate the insurance claim." Francois clapped his hands, motioning for his ham-fisted security men do the same. "Very good. But for one small faux pas, we would get a sleeper to expose the Mona Lisa. Someone like Francois paused for dramatic effect. Dr. Crow, for instance. You see, it would have to be an independent academic, a trusted scholar of the arts. This latest piece of information caught Andrew on the back foot, and his reactions were not quick enough for his face not to display the fact. Yes, your dear friend was working for us and being handsomely paid to do nothing. That is, of course, until he broke his cover and commented very publicly on Dan Brown and his book. The Frenchman made a spitting gesture, which almost made Andrew smile. This was the same way that Dr. Miller had always referred to the book in question. The memory quickly turned to anger, as he thought of the life that had been wasted in the most violent and public way.
"Why did you kill Jonathan Miller?"
Andrew shouted.
"He was going to ground with what he had discovered. He couldn't even bear to admit the truth to himself, let alone tell the world."
"A risk we could not afford to take." The Frenchman uttered the words with such indifference that it unnerved Andrew, whose bravado once again deserted him. "So you see, we win all ends up. If the truth is never exposed, we continue to collect the insurance premium. If the truth comes out, we can walk away without paying out on the policy." The Frenchman paused. "That is, if we have another sleeper in place, someone who knows a great deal about Renaissance art and is well respected in his profession." Chapter 9. As the lights flickered in the subterranean gallery of the Louvre, Andrew Cartwright reflected on the deal he had made with the devil. Accepting the poison chalice had prevented him from being buried in an unmarked grave in Cheston Cemetery. Instead, he had swapped that fate for his gentle but persuasive ingratiation into the art alumni. In the preceding 6 months, Francois Lafrère had been introducing him to the right people, showing him off in the right places, and creating a legend like that of any good sleeper. This continued until Francois deemed Andrew ready for his master plan to be put back into operation. As he stood facing the haunting figure of Lady Gioconda, known to the rest of the world as Mona Lisa, he knew that his commitment to carry out extensive X-ray photography was merely a smokescreen to establish a paper trail he hoped he would never have to use. Although the backstory had been explained to him many times, there were still pieces of the jigsaw that didn't quite make sense. He knew that Giacomo had somehow written on the lower layer of the vellum manuscript, making it virtually impossible to copy. Copying the manuscript would of course been a pointless exercise, as the original was always needed for provenance. He also knew that Giacomo had claimed, albeit cryptically, that he had painted one of the world's most famous paintings. There was, however, still a nagging doubt in the back of his mind that he just couldn't shift. He recalled with a shiver Dr. Miller's final moments, his last words playing over and over in his mind. "Pop the panel. Pop the panel." As Andrew glanced around his self-imposed prison cell, he reflected on the passage of the manuscript which still tore at his brain like an overzealous lion on the back of some meandering wildebeest.
"Yes, I shall be forever known as a great painter, but only ever from the back."
"Pop the panel," Andrew muttered. "Pop the panel, only from the back. Pop the panel. Not pop the panel. Poplar panel, only from the back." It appeared that Lady Gioconda was truly smiling down on him as the last piece of this convoluted puzzle fell into place. Andrew knew that the Mona Lisa was not a traditional oil-on-canvas painting. Leonardo, an impoverished painter at the time, had started the process on a single panel of poplar wood. Over the years, many layers of the painting had been X-rayed and photographed, but never had they thought to look at the painting from the back. In a single stride, his lithe figure had crossed the small, gloomy gallery. He reached up and wrenched the cedar panel from its bulletproof casing. With one last look into those haunting eyes, he roughly turned the lady over and shone an ultraviolet light into her most private place. It took some time for his eyes to get accustomed to the anemic blue glow, but then, as if by magic, the lady revealed her most heartfelt and intimate secret. There, beneath layers of thick gesso, lay a message that had not been seen by anyone except Giacomo in over 500 years. His knowledge of the Italian language was sketchy, and was an area he knew he needed to improve. However, the same high school Italian that had helped him translate the manuscript was more than enough. Stark in its poetic resonance, it simply read, "Charcoal and Poplar, circa 1504, by Leonardo da Vinci. Oil on Poplar, work completed by Gian Giacomo, circa 1519.
Only from the back will my true genius be recognized."
Slumping back onto the stone-cold floor which had become so familiar to him, he knew his fate was sealed. Without giving himself time to change his mind, he raced to the solid steel vault door and slammed it shut, hermetically sealing himself inside. The sounds of the guards banging and shooting at the outside of the door did nothing to deviate him from this, his final solution. Smashing the glass on the fire alarm, he locked the door of the vault, which was designed to prevent a fire getting within 30 feet of the Mona Lisa. That is, of course, unless the fire was started within the vault itself. He crossed the floor to where his bag had laid unmolested for the past 2 hours. Within the bag was the manuscript, which he had purposely carried with him to this, his final destination. In a small pocket in the front of the bag sat an inhaler, which, originally intended as a cure for his fictional asthma, now contained a small amount of lighter fluid. Without stopping to think, he doused the manuscript and the Lady Gioconda with the volatile liquid. He knew this is how it had to end, and with a tear in his eye, he propelled a lighted match towards the world's most valuable painting. As the angry orange and blue flames danced around her slight and elegant wrists and proceeded towards her world-famous smile, she looked down on him, and with a glint in her eye, said, "Thank you." Chapter 10. As the rain-swept streets of Paris began to awaken, the smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. Newspaper placards across the city, and indeed the world, screamed out the same message. Mona Lisa destroyed by fire. Insurance company to pay £600 million. An English stranger smiled wryly at the headline before heading into Paris's central station. As the morning rush hour got into full swing, the Englishman was joined on the train to St. Moritz by an older gentleman with unruly hair and leather patches on his sleeves. Some might say he was the epitome of a nutty English professor.